He mapped the universe without leaving his chair. He tamed infinity, bent chaos into symmetry, and gave the world a language to describe the impossible. He calculated the heavens before telescopes could see them. He gave engineers the math to build bridges, astronomers the laws to trace stars, and thinkers the tools to decode reality itself. Every modern equation, every orbit, every algorithm carries his fingerprint, and yet he spent half his life in darkness. He couldn't see, but he saw farther than anyone in history. How does a man with no sight outthink the universe itself? Let's go back and find out. Basel, Switzerland, April 15th, 1707. The bells of St. Martin's Church rang across the Rhine as a newborn cried beneath the wooden beams of a modest Protestant home. His father, Paul Euler, a theologian and pastor, saw his son's birth as a promise of faith fulfilled. His mother, Marguerite Brucker, held him close, whispering prayers of gratitude into the spring air. The world outside was small. Narrow cobblestone streets, ink-stained scholars, and the constant hum of theology debated in every corner. Yet inside that quiet home, something far larger stirred, a child whose mind would not rest on scripture alone. In those early years, faith was the language of survival. The Euler household began each day with prayer, each meal with reverence, and each evening with hymns echoing through candlelight. But Leonhard's eyes wandered. While his father read aloud from the Book of Psalms, the boy's gaze drifted to how the candlelight fractured through the glass window, forming perfect angles on the table. He did not yet have the words for what he saw: reflection, refraction, symmetry. But he felt something divine hidden inside the geometry of light. To him, wonder itself was a form of worship. By the time he could write, Leonhard was already questioning the world his father accepted as complete. While other children memorized verses, he asked why stars stayed in place, why raindrops curved, why the bell's echo changed pitch as one walked away. Each question made his father smile at first, a clever child blessed with curiosity, until those questions grew sharper, reaching places theology could not. Some things, Paul warned gently, are not for man to know. Leonhard's reply came softly. Then why does God let me think of them? The home in Basel became a silent battleground between obedience and discovery. Paul hoped his son would follow his path, a scholar of scripture, a shepherd of souls. But the child's world was already wider than sermons could hold. Books filled with numbers, borrowed from the university, began to replace the family's catechisms on his desk. While his father wrote sermons on divine perfection, Leonhard traced circles until midnight, convinced that perfection could be measured, not merely preached. And in those quiet moments, the flicker of the candle, the sound of ink scratching paper, a pattern began to form that would define the rest of his life. Faith gave him boundaries. Curiosity taught him how to cross them. In Basel's small, disciplined world, a boy had begun to look beyond the visible, not to defy his father's God, but to understand him through the mathematics of creation. Sunday mornings in Basel were sacred. The church bells called the faithful, and every family filed into the pews dressed in modest humility. Paul Euler's sermons filled the air with the certainty of divine order, of a universe ruled by God's perfect hand. But on one such morning, while his father spoke of heaven, young Leonhard's attention was elsewhere. In the margin of the family Bible, he was sketching triangles, measuring the invisible symmetry of the wooden beams above him. Where his father saw divine design, Leonhard saw divine mathematics. To him, the sermon was proof not of faith's limits, but of reason's invitation. At home, the tension between father and son grew quietly, almost lovingly. Paul would find sheets of parchment filled with geometric shapes and half-finished sums tucked beneath his son's pillow. "These are not the words of prophets," he'd sigh. "You are meant to study scripture, not circles." But Leonhard's voice, gentle yet insistent, replied, "A circle never ends, Father. Isn't that what eternity looks like?" It wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. He believed God had written the world not in verses, but in numbers. Basel's narrow streets became his secret classroom. Leonhard studied the movement of the sun across rooftops, the reflection of light on the Rhine, the arc of a thrown pebble. Each observation felt like decoding a sacred pattern no one else had noticed. He began to sense that God's handwriting was hidden in every curve and shadow. And if he learned the right language, he could read creation itself. Yet, every discovery carried guilt. To question the church's teachings was to risk arrogance, perhaps even sin. But curiosity, once awakened, is a force that no doctrine can cage. Paul Euler, torn between pride and fear, decided to test his son's devotion. One evening, he placed a theological text in front of him and said, "If your faith is strong, this will feed it more than numbers ever could." Leonhard read dutifully, but by dawn, he had covered the margins with equations derived from the text's proportions. "Even theology has its measure," he said, unaware of how that single sentence would haunt his father. The war between faith and curiosity had no victor, only revelation. They were two halves of the same truth. And so, in the stillness of that Basel home, a paradox was born. The boy raised to serve the church had found his own form of worship, through the logic of the infinite. Each calculation became a prayer, each question, a hymn. He wasn't running from God. He was chasing him through the fabric of the universe. And that pursuit, that sacred hunger for understanding, would carry him far beyond the borders of Basel, into a world where numbers and faith would no longer be enemies, but eternal companions. The year was 1720, and the young Leonhard Euler was already known among Basel's scholars as the boy who solved problems faster than professors could assign them. But his father, wary of pride, forbade him from seeking mathematical fame. He was to study theology, God's language, not man's. Still, the boy's fascination deepened until fate intervened in the form of Johann Bernoulli, one of the greatest mathematicians in Europe. Bernoulli, a man whose mind had shaped calculus alongside Leibniz, saw something rare in Leonhard's questions. Not the curiosity of a student, but the hunger of an equal. Bernoulli agreed to meet him in secret. Under the soft glow of lamplight, in a small study filled with ink-stained papers and the smell of candle wax, a quiet revolution began. Leonhard listened as Bernoulli explained the mysteries of calculus, the language of infinitesimals. Quantities so small they bordered on the divine. "Mathematics," Bernoulli told him, "is the way God wrote the universe. Learn to read it, and you will see creation as it truly is." The words struck Leonhard deeper than any sermon ever had. Each lesson felt like revelation. Where others saw mere symbols, Euler saw motion, rivers flowing, stars orbiting, light bending. He copied Bernoulli's equations by hand, not for grades or praise, but because the act itself felt holy. His father had taught him to pray before speaking to God. Bernoulli taught him that to calculate was to listen. The boy who once sketched shapes in sermon margins now filled pages with the language of infinity, and every night the lamplight burned later. His mother worried. His father grew silent. Yet even Paul Euler, the devout minister, couldn't deny that something divine moved through his son. "He learns faster than the mind can think," Bernoulli whispered once, astonished. Basel had no title for what Leonhard had become. Not yet a mathematician, not yet a man, but already a vessel for genius, a bridge between faith and discovery. And as the bells of St. Martin's tolled midnight, Leonhard would leave Bernoulli's study and walk home under the pale glow of moonlight. The streets were silent, but in his mind, the world was alive with motion. The laws of nature whispered through him, and though he was still a boy, he carried the first fire of immortality in his hands. When Leonhard came of age, his father pressed a familiar argument. The pulpit, not the pen, was his calling. Paul Euler believed his son's gift for logic would serve God best through theology. But Leonhard's heart was already elsewhere. To him, equations were not rivals of faith, they were extensions of it. "Father," he said gently one evening, "to understand how the world was made is also to understand the Maker." Yet the elder Euler saw danger in ambition. He feared the pride of knowledge that Scripture had warned of since Eden. The tension stretched through their home like a tight string. Mealtime conversations turned into quiet wars. His father quoted verses on obedience. Leonhard countered with questions about nature and order. He loved his father deeply, but felt trapped in a world too small for his thoughts. In secret, he continued writing letters to Johann Bernoulli, who urged him to pursue mathematics fully. "Do not bury the talent heaven has given you," Bernoulli wrote, echoing Scripture in defense of reason. It was the blessing Leonhard needed. One cold evening, Leonhard made his decision. He stood before his father in the dim study and said, "I will not enter the ministry." Paul's face hardened, more in sorrow than anger. The silence that followed was long, heavy, sacred. In that moment, the boy ceased to be a child of the church and became something rarer. A man guided by his own conviction. It was rebellion, yes, but not defiance for its own sake. It was faith in reason, belief that God's truth was vast enough to survive inquiry. For nights afterward, Leonhard lay awake, listening to the winter wind against the shutters, wondering if he had disappointed heaven, but the thought that followed brought peace. If his pursuit of truth was sincere, then perhaps heaven itself had chosen him for it. That paradox, faith through logic, became the compass of his life. When he next met Bernoulli, the old man smiled knowingly. "You have chosen the harder sermon," he said, "but one day it will reach more souls than any church." Leonhard nodded. For the first time, he felt both free and terrified. The world of certainty had ended. The world of discovery had begun. At 13, Leonhard Euler completed his master's degree at the University of Basel, a prodigy whose mind outpaced his mentors. Yet Basel was too small, too polite, too cautious for a spirit like his. He longed for challenge, for purpose, for a place where ideas were not confined by doctrine. That opportunity came when the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences announced an open call for young mathematicians to serve under the patronage of Tsar Peter the Great. The letter reached Bernoulli's desk, and he immediately thought of Euler. Under Bernoulli's guidance, Leonhard applied, submitting a paper that impressed the Academy's directors. His methods were bold, his reasoning flawless. "A mind of rare genius," they wrote back. But travel to Russia was not a casual endeavor. The journey meant leaving his family, his homeland, and perhaps any return to the life he knew. His father hesitated. His mother wept. Leonhard promised he would remain faithful, both to them and to God. Yet in his heart, he knew that destiny rarely waits for permission. The journey east began with riverboats and winding roads, his notebooks packed tightly beside him. Snow fell on the carriage windows as he crossed the German plains, each mile carrying him farther from the sermons of his childhood and closer to the realm of reason's empire. He studied the stars along the way, noting their patterns, their distances, their mathematical rhythm. Even in motion, his mind refused rest, as if the universe itself had become his new scripture. By the time he reached St. Petersburg, the empire was changing. The Russian court was alive with ambition, driven by the dream of modernization and science. The young Swiss mathematician arrived not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim, one who sought enlightenment through numbers. The city's frozen rivers and golden domes shimmered like symbols of the world he was about to enter. At 19, he was offered a coveted position in the Russian Academy. A new world awaited, filled with scholars, challenges, and mysteries yet unsolved. The boy who once questioned his father's sermons now stood at the threshold of a different kind of faith, the faith that reason, too, could be divine. And as the winter wind swept across the Neva River, Leonhard Euler, barely a man, stepped forward into history. When Leonhard Euler first arrived in St. Petersburg in 1727, the air itself felt foreign, cold enough to bite, sharp enough to test resolve. The city, newly carved from marshland by Peter the Great's vision, shimmered with ambition and contradiction. Palaces rose beside frozen canals. Gold domes glowed above streets lined with soldiers and scholars alike. Russia wanted to be modern, to rival Europe not with armies, but with ideas. And here, in this strange, magnificent experiment of a city, a 20-year-old Swiss mathematician stepped into history, carrying only ink, faith, and a mind that refused limits. The Russian Academy of Sciences was unlike anything he had known in Basel. Its halls echoed with multiple languages: German, French, Latin, and Russian, blending into a chorus of intellect and rivalry. The scholars were brilliant but wary. Many were foreigners who had come chasing fortune or recognition, few expecting to stay long. Euler, quiet and courteous, seemed unassuming at first, his accent thick, his posture modest. But beneath that humility lay a hunger sharper than the St. Petersburg winter. He had come not to survive, but to prove that genius could bloom anywhere. Each day began before dawn. The Academy's observatories looked out over the icy Neva River, where Leonhard would spend hours calculating celestial motion by candlelight. His fingers, often numb from the cold, moved with mechanical precision across pages, recording angles, patterns, and proofs. He learned Russian faster than anyone expected, not from formal lessons, but from curiosity. The same curiosity that had driven him to study calculus in secret back home. The locals found him strange, a foreigner who smiled to himself while scribbling equations in taverns, who could recite the movement of the planets as easily as other men told stories. Yet even as his reputation began to grow, loneliness followed him like a shadow. Letters from home arrived rarely. The familiar warmth of Basil's quiet faith was replaced by the noise of ambition. The Russian court was filled with intrigue, politics, and dangerous pride. But within that chaos, Euler found a kind of clarity. If truth is universal, he wrote to Bernoulli, then it must shine even here. Those words would become his anchor, a belief that the pursuit of knowledge transcended borders, languages, and empires. And so, night after night, as snow gathered outside his window, Leonhard Euler worked, driven not by money or fame, but by the sheer joy of uncovering order within the universe's confusion. The boy who once defied his father's church now found himself in a different kind of temple, a city of science rising from ice, where faith and reason could finally coexist under the same sky. Within months of arriving, Euler found companionship in two familiar faces, Daniel and Nicholas Bernoulli, the sons of his old mentor. The brothers had already made their mark in Russia, teaching mechanics and fluid motion at the academy. Their reunion was warm, almost brotherly, built on shared memories of Basel and nights spent at their father's table. Together, they formed a trio that would soon redefine mathematics for the entire continent. But beneath that friendship ran a quiet tension, one born not of malice, but of brilliance itself. For in every mind that seeks perfection, envy hides in the shadows. The Bernoulli brothers admired Euler's energy, his relentless drive, his ability to translate abstract theory into elegant proofs. Yet even they were startled by the speed of his understanding. Daniel once handed him a problem in hydrodynamics, expecting it to take days. Euler returned the next morning with a complete solution and an improvement. The brothers laughed, outwardly proud, but inside, a small unease stirred. What happens when the student surpasses the teacher's sons? The three men became both collaborators and competitors. They shared discoveries over wine and long winter nights, debating theories that would shape the foundations of physics and mathematics. But arguments grew sharper as recognition from Europe began pouring in, most of it naming Euler first. Nicholas grew distant, Daniel oscillated between affection and frustration. They loved him as a friend, but feared him as a rival. Leonhard has no limits, Daniel confided to a colleague. That is both his gift and our curse. Euler, ever gentle, refused to see conflict where others did. He continued writing papers, crediting the Bernoullis generously, even when their pride prevented them from returning the favor. To him, knowledge was not a competition, it was communion. Every discovery was shared grace, a continuation of divine order. He wrote, "We are all servants of the same truth. But in a world ruled by egos and empires, such humility often isolates the one who possesses it." By 1733, the friendships that had once anchored him began to fray. Nicholas left the academy. Daniel grew colder. Yet out of that tension came transformation. For the first time, Euler realized that genius was both a blessing and a burden. A fire that warms the world but burns the hand that carries it. And so, as friendships faded, his focus sharpened. The isolation that once frightened him became fuel for what would soon follow, the problem that would immortalize his name. By 1735, Euler had found a rhythm in the empire's chaos. Between lectures and the endless snow, he began exchanging puzzles with fellow scholars across Europe. Small amusements meant to keep the mind agile. One of them came from the Prussian city of Königsberg, a place crisscrossed by 7 bridges over 2 rivers. Citizens boasted that no one could walk across every bridge once without repeating. It was a tavern riddle, a game. To Euler, it was something else entirely, a hidden doorway into the geometry of logic itself. He drew the map on his desk, candlelight trembling over the ink. Most mathematicians would have measured distances or lengths. Euler didn't. He stripped away everything irrelevant, the rivers, the ground, even the idea of space, leaving only points and connections. The city dissolved into pure thought. He began asking not how far, but how many. When the last equation aligned, he smiled faintly. There was no path that crossed them all. But in the failure, he had uncovered something profound, a new way to study connection itself. Days later, he presented his proof to the Academy. Some dismissed it. Too simple, too playful. But others felt the weight of what he'd done. He had birthed a new language, a mathematics that described relationships rather than quantities. Centuries later, it would be called graph theory, the foundation of everything from computer networks to city planning. Yet in that room, it was just a quiet man explaining why a riddle mattered. He spoke softly, without triumph. "Sometimes," he said, "the path we cannot take teaches us more than the ones we can." That night, he walked home along the frozen Neva, the city lights shimmering like bridges of their own. He thought of Basil, of Bernoulli's lessons, of his father's warnings. Every choice, every path, every friendship. Each was a crossing, some impossible to complete. The beauty lay in the pattern, not the perfection. To Euler, life itself was a network of bridges, faith and reason, love and isolation, sight and blindness, all connected by invisible logic. The 7 bridges problem spread across Europe within months. Scholars wrote to St. Petersburg in disbelief, and for the first time, Euler's name began to stand beside Newton's. But he felt no pride, only purpose. He had proved that even trivial questions could unlock eternal truths. That the world's mysteries hid not in distance or depth, but in how things are bound together. And with that realization, his ascent truly began. In a city of power and politics, love found Euler quietly. Her name was Katharina Gsell, daughter of a Swiss-born painter at the Russian court, a woman of patience, quick wit, and calm warmth that could soften even the winter air. She wasn't impressed by the genius that others spoke of in whispers. When they first met, he spilled ink on his sleeve mid-conversation, too distracted by an unfinished equation to notice. She laughed, not mockingly, but with the gentle disbelief of someone seeing a man completely consumed by thought. For Euler, that laugh became home. They married in 1733 in a modest chapel surrounded by snow and candlelight, far from the grandeur of the Tsar's palaces. The reception was small. Friends from the academy, fellow scholars, and a handful of curious courtiers who had never seen the famous mathematician smile so much. Their home on the edge of St. Petersburg was simple but alive. Walls lined with books, paintings by Katharina's father, and a cradle that would soon rock with the rhythm of their first child's cries. It was in this warmth, not in solitude, that Euler's creativity reached its peak. Evenings were a symphony of contrasts, the scent of soup and oil paint mixed with the scratch of quills. While Katharina read by the fire, Leonhard calculated planetary motion at the kitchen table, a baby asleep in his lap. The city outside froze over, but their home glowed, laughter, music, and the rustle of parchment filling every corner. He once told a friend, "I find the universe no more complex than marriage. Both require balance, and both demand grace." It was a rare glimpse of humor from a man so often buried in thought. As the years passed, their household grew. Children, friends, students, all orbiting around Euler like planets around a star. He was stern in discipline, but tender in affection. His lessons delivered with the same patience he used in his proofs. For him, love was not a distraction from intellect. It was the proof that the abstract could coexist with the human. In every equation he wrote, there was a trace of her, the steadiness of her voice, the warmth of her hands, the certainty that even in infinity, one constant could remain. But beneath the laughter, time waited. The long nights, the strain of endless calculation, and the cold of St. Petersburg began to wear on him. His colleagues warned that even the brightest light burns itself faster, and soon that warning would prove prophetic. In the spring of 1735, illness swept through St. Petersburg, an invisible storm of fever and weakness that claimed dozens within weeks. Euler worked through the first chills, dismissing them as fatigue. But the fever grew merciless. By June, he could no longer rise from bed. The city blurred around him, candles fading into white haze. Doctors whispered typhus. The man who once charted the heavens now struggled to measure his own breath. Yet even there, in delirium, his mind refused silence. As his body weakened, his right eye began to fail. He described it later as if a shadow had passed across the world. Not total darkness, but a veil that separated him from the clarity he once knew. For days, he drifted between pain and lucidity, haunted by the thought that his life's work might end in the same obscurity as his sight. But genius, when bound to purpose, becomes defiance. Euler began scribbling again, numbers trembling on the page, ink smudged by fever. His wife begged him to rest. He answered softly, "If I stop now, I may never start again." On that bed, sweating and half blind, he turned his attention to a century-old mystery that had humbled Europe's brightest: the Basel problem, the sum of all reciprocal squares. Mathematicians before him had failed. The answer seemed unreachable. But Euler's fever turned into fuel. His thoughts raced, collapsing centuries of trial into a single insight. The pattern revealed itself like divine whisper, a number that felt almost sacred. Pi squared over 6, pi squared over 6, pi squared over 6. When he wrote it down, he smiled faintly through exhaustion. He had done it. The impossible had yielded to perseverance. When news of his solution spread, scholars across Europe stood in awe. Letters poured in from Paris, London, and Berlin. The blind Swiss mathematician, they said, had cracked a riddle that no one else could. His fame exploded overnight, but behind the acclaim, one truth lingered. His sight had dimmed permanently. The cost of brilliance had been paid in light. Euler accepted it without bitterness. To him, it was a fair exchange. He had lost one eye to sickness, but gained immortality in numbers. "If the Lord took one light," he told Katharina, "he left me the one that matters." From that moment forward, he worked not in fear of blindness, but in reverence for what remained. The fever had nearly ended his life, but instead, it redefined it. By the late 1730s, Leonhard Euler's name had become legend. Across Europe, his theorems circled like rumors of a miracle, whispered in universities, debated in royal salons, admired by scientists who had never met him. But behind that fame lay exhaustion. Years of labor, illness, and court politics in Russia had drained him. So when Frederick the Great of Prussia extended an invitation to Berlin, promising freedom, respect, and peace, Euler accepted. He imagined a sanctuary of intellect. He was wrong. Berlin was no quiet refuge. It was a theater of brilliance and ego. Frederick, a philosopher king and admirer of Enlightenment reason, surrounded himself with poets, skeptics, and provocateurs. To him, intellect was entertainment. Ideas were weapons, not devotions. When Euler arrived, modest and devout, the court saw not a celebrity, but an oddity. A mathematician who prayed before proving, who bowed before both God and geometry. They welcomed his genius, but dismissed his faith as relic. The stage had been set for a clash of worlds, reason without reverence versus faith without arrogance. Still, Euler entered the capital with quiet optimism. He accepted the directorship of the Berlin Academy and devoted himself to teaching, writing, and advancing the sciences. His methods were revolutionary: order, clarity, discipline. Under his direction, the academy flourished. He turned abstract math into applied mastery. Optics, mechanics, engineering, astronomy. For a time, Berlin hummed with creation. But in the corridors of the palace, envy whispered. The king's courtiers mocked Euler's plainness. He was too sincere, too pious, too Swiss for their wit-soaked games. Frederick, impatient with humility, began to test him. He paraded him before philosophers and poets, expecting wit, receiving only answers in equations. When court gatherings turned to sarcasm, Euler remained silent. "He is clever," one courtier sneered, "but he cannot converse." Frederick laughed, half amused, half irritated. "Then let him converse with the stars." And so he did. In the glittering tension of Berlin, where intellect was spectacle, Leonhard Euler retreated into the one realm no one could mock, the infinite. He had entered an empire ruled by pride and discovered that brilliance in the wrong palace becomes both crown and curse. The Prussian court adored Voltaire, the philosopher who could turn blasphemy into charm and cruelty into wit. He and Frederick were twin flames of Enlightenment vanity, dazzling, merciless, unstoppable. When Euler arrived with his quiet faith and soft voice, he seemed like a ghost from an older world. Voltaire found him amusing at first. A man who proves heaven by numbers, but amusement soon turned to mockery. "He calculates like a machine," Voltaire declared. "God must be proud of his accountant." The court laughed. Euler did not. He didn't argue, didn't flinch. He simply turned back to his work. When others wielded words like weapons, he wielded silence. And from that silence came proofs that would outlive every jest. Each insult only deepened his resolve. "If laughter is their logic," he once wrote, "then reason will be my reply." Within months, he had produced new treatises on motion, sound, and celestial bodies, works that humbled even his detractors. The philosopher king had his spectacle, though not the one he expected. A man dismantling arrogance with calculation. Frederick admired Euler's mind, but could never grasp his spirit. He called him back to court dinners, teasing him in front of ministers and musicians. When asked about metaphysics, Euler would shrug. When pressed about atheism, he would smile faintly and say, "God counts differently." To Frederick, it was maddening. To Voltaire, it was infuriating. The duel between faith and wit played out in words and formulas, one temporal, one eternal. Yet behind the scenes, Frederick depended on Euler more than he'd admit. The king's engineers used his designs to fortify cities and canals. His naval officers navigated with Euler's astronomical tables. For every sneer, there was quiet reliance. He might not have entertained the court, but he built the machinery that sustained it. And while others sought applause, Euler sought precision, and in that pursuit, he found peace that no mockery could touch. When Voltaire finally left Berlin, tired of Frederick's pride and his own, Euler stayed. The city's laughter had lost its sting. Genius, he had learned, does not need defense. Silence had become his most eloquent proof, one written not in argument, but in eternity. While Berlin's salons argued about philosophy, Euler looked upward. The night sky above Prussia became his real kingdom, an empire of orbits and invisible laws. From his study window, he mapped the dance of planets, predicting tides, eclipses, and comet paths with a precision that stunned Europe. Where others saw chaos, he saw choreography. Each equation he wrote was an act of faith, proof that the heavens themselves could be measured, not merely admired. He turned astronomy into prophecy, mechanics into poetry. His discoveries rewrote navigation and astronomy. Sailors crossing unknown seas carried his calculations. Pages of tables so accurate they could steer entire fleets by starlight. Astronomers across France and Britain used his formulas to predict the motion of Jupiter's moons. Even when war separated nations, his mathematics united them in truth. His mind had become a compass for the world. In the age of reason, kings sought armies. Euler gave them certainty. The king who once mocked him now relied on him. Frederick praised him in public, calling him the living machine of the academy, though the words carried as much envy as admiration. To Euler, titles meant nothing. What mattered was that his work had transcended borders, languages, and pride. He was no longer the Swiss boy seeking faith through logic. He was the mathematician through whom the universe confessed its order. But even triumph carried a cost. Endless nights bent over manuscripts, strained eyes, and unbroken focus began to erode his strength. His partial blindness from earlier years worsened. Headaches haunted him. Yet, as the physical world dimmed, the intellectual one grew brighter. He once told a friend, "I see less of the world, but more of its design." The man mocked for faith was now becoming a prophet of reason, one whose vision no longer required eyes. By 1766, he had completed over 400 works, enough to fill shelves across Europe. But Berlin, once a beacon, had turned hostile. Frederick's attention shifted, the court grew restless, and Euler's humility no longer amused them. When the chance came to return to Russia under Catherine the Great, he accepted without hesitation. He had given Berlin his brilliance, and Berlin had given him scars. It was time to go home, not to rest, but to begin again. By the 1750s, the Berlin Academy was flourishing. Under Euler's methodical hand, its halls echoed with invention and order. He reorganized its departments, mentored young scientists, and poured his genius into papers that arrived from his study faster than the scribes could copy them. The Academy had never been so productive, or so divided. Success attracts light, and light attracts shadows. Envy began to settle in the corners of brilliance. Frederick's ministers grew wary of Euler's influence. Some whispered that he had turned the Academy into a church of mathematics, too rigid, too moral, too apolitical. The poets and philosophers wanted wit and spectacle. Euler gave them silence and precision. They mocked him for his simplicity, calling him the clockmaker of God. Yet in the same breath, they relied on the very calculations they ridiculed. His formulas kept the kingdom's ships afloat and its fortresses aligned with the stars. His faith made him their conscience, and that made him dangerous. Letters from home began to weigh heavier on him. Russia, once the land of exile, now called to him like memory. News arrived that Catherine the Great had risen to power, a monarch who valued intellect over ego, faith over cynicism. Berlin, once a city of hope, had become a cage. "I serve truth," he wrote in his journal, "but truth here serves fashion." He missed the warmth of his wife's laughter, the quiet steadiness of work untainted by politics. For the first time, the endless equations no longer felt infinite. They felt heavy. Within the academy, factions formed. Some worshipped him, others sought to unseat him. Voltaire's ghost lingered in the air, his old jests echoing through conversations. The court began to prefer charm over genius. Even Frederick, once an admirer, grew distant. "Euler," he said coldly, "knows everything, except how to live among men." It was meant as a jest, but it cut deeply. Euler had given the king his brilliance, but not his soul. And so, behind the gleaming marble of Berlin, a quiet man began to fade from its social light. He withdrew from dinners, spoke less in meetings, spent more time gazing through the window of his study. Not at the city, but at the sky beyond it. He longed for the silence of St. Petersburg, for the days when thought itself was pure. The empire of reason had turned into a court of vanity. And though he still produced work that changed the world, his heart was already gone. It began as a familiar ache, a dull pain behind the left eye, the kind he'd ignored 1,000 times before. But this time, the pain didn't fade. His vision blurred, lines bending where they should be straight, light fracturing into shapes no geometry could explain. He told no one at first. Work was his refuge, and blindness was a fear he refused to name. But by the winter of 1765, the truth became undeniable. The infection that had claimed one eye years before had returned for the other. He continued to write, dictating equations from memory as candles flickered uselessly before him. His assistants watched in awe. He no longer saw the paper, yet his words described entire systems of the universe with perfect precision. "The quill obeys his mind alone," one said. It's as if he sees from within. The city around him blurred into rumor and shape. But in the darkness, his imagination grew sharper. His blindness was not a void. It was an expansion inward. Frederick's court heard of his condition with a mix of pity and impatience. Some whispered that God had punished him for arrogance. Others, that he was faking humility to draw sympathy. Only a few understood what was happening, that the world's greatest mathematician was crossing a threshold few men could survive. The loss of sight, but not of vision. Euler accepted it quietly. He said to a student, "The eyes deceive, but the mind remembers perfectly." By spring, the world had vanished. Candles became sensations of warmth. Faces became voices. Sunlight became memory. The city that once glittered now existed only as geometry in his mind. And yet, his output didn't stop. It increased. The blindness freed him from distraction. He dictated faster, recalled more, reasoned deeper. To those who visited, it seemed impossible. But Euler had always seen what others could not. As the final light of Berlin faded from his sight, his decision became clear. He would return to St. Petersburg, not as a man broken by illness, but as one reborn in darkness. If sight was a gift, he told Katharina, then blindness is its perfection. The empire of vanity had lost its hold on him. The mathematician who once calculated the stars was now ready to work by faith alone. When the ship carrying Leonhard Euler reached the port of St. Petersburg in 1766, the wind cut sharply against the water, yet he smiled as though feeling sunlight. The city he had left decades earlier had changed, grander now, steadier under Catherine the Great. But it welcomed him like a long-lost son. As he stepped onto the dock, guided gently by his son's hand, onlookers whispered, "The blind man who could still see the universe." For Catherine, he was no curiosity. He was proof that intellect transcends frailty. She greeted him personally, calling him the miracle of the human mind. In her presence, Euler bowed lightly, his eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. The Empress promised him comfort, assistance, and the freedom to work without distraction. Unlike Frederick's court of mockery, Catherine's was a temple of admiration. "If the eyes fail," she said, "let the empire borrow yours." Her words struck him deeply, not as flattery, but as understanding. For the first time in years, he felt seen for what he was, not what he lacked. His return wasn't just symbolic, it was resurrection. The streets of St. Petersburg smelled of snow and ink, the same scent that had filled his youth. he was home among scholars who treated him not as fragile, but as formidable. Within weeks, he was installed in his old residence near the academy, his study arranged so that every quill, page, and ruler lay precisely where he remembered them from memory. Blindness had robbed him of sight, but not of system, and in his mind, the world remained luminous. Soon, his house became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Mathematicians, philosophers, and travelers came to witness him work. Some expected tragedy. Instead, they found serenity. Euler moved with confidence through his rooms, naming every object by position, every sound by origin. His memory was no longer just sharp, it was supernatural. He sees by remembrance, one scholar remarked. He walks through his own mind. For Catherine's court, he was both legend and lesson, a reminder that greatness isn't granted by vision, but by persistence. As snow fell outside his window, Euler returned to his table, dipped his quill in ink, and resumed the conversation with the infinite that blindness had only paused. The study hummed with the rhythm of pens scratching on parchment. Around Euler sat 3 assistants, each trying desperately to keep up with the torrent of words that poured from him. He spoke in calm, measured tones, dictating not sentences, but worlds, formulas, theories, entire books unfolding from memory. His blindness had turned him into a living archive. Without pause, he reconstructed years of lost work, notes, proofs, and ideas that others had thought vanished forever in the Berlin fire. "Slower, sir," one assistant begged. Euler smiled. "Then think faster." His humor was light, his pace relentless. From dawn until evening, he dictated. Fluid mechanics before breakfast, number theory by noon, astronomy after supper. Pages filled faster than they could be copied, and when his scribes faltered, he simply continued, holding each unfinished thought suspended in his mind until they caught up. It was said he could pause mid-sentence for hours and resume without a word misplaced. Neighbors spoke of hearing his voice through the night, echoing formulas like hymns. But inside that house, there was no strain, no mania, only order. His blindness had sharpened his focus into something almost divine. "My eyes are gone," he said once, "but the light remains." He wasn't exaggerating. Between 1766 and 1783, he produced nearly half of his life's work. Over 400 papers, an output unmatched in the history of science. Visitors described the scene with reverence. A man seated in calm darkness, dictating truths that others struggled even to read. His assistants whispered among themselves that it was impossible. No human could remember so much, so precisely. Yet every test proved him right. He calculated, reasoned, composed, and all from memory. He no longer worked in the world. He worked above it. In the silence of his blindness, infinity had found its voice. To outsiders, mathematics was an abstract fortress, cold, impenetrable. To Euler, it was architecture made visible. In the last decades of his life, he rebuilt the very foundation of numbers. With blindness as his constant companion, he unified trigonometry into a single elegant framework. He defined the constant E, the base of natural growth, and showed how it intertwined with pi and the imaginary I, merging them into a single, flawless equation. It was a line so perfect that later generations would call it the most beautiful in all mathematics. EP plus 1 equals 0. He didn't stop there. In the quiet of his study, he uncovered the polyhedron formula, a relationship between shapes that hinted at symmetry hidden deep within creation, what others saw as separate branches of science. He saw as one vast cathedral of logic, arches of geometry, pillars of algebra, a dome of infinite harmony. To Euler, numbers were not tools. They were the architecture of the universe. His work spilled into every discipline: optics, astronomy, fluid dynamics, even engineering. Ships navigated by his calculations. Bridges stood because of his ratios. He translated chaos into clarity, turning nature's turbulence into something measurable, predictable, beautiful. To him, mathematics wasn't a language. It was truth itself speaking back. Catherine's court often marveled at his resilience. Ministers joked that the empire could crumble, and Euler would not notice. He'd simply recalculate its fall. But behind the jest lay awe. The man who could not see the world had become the one who explained it. His blindness had not confined him. It had refined him. In those final productive years, his study became a sanctuary of universal order, where ink, memory, and imagination merged. To the world, Euler had unified the laws of motion and form. To himself, he had simply written down what he'd always known. That creation, in its truest language, was perfect symmetry. By the 1780s, Euler's body had begun to betray him. Joints stiffened, hearing dulled, yet his mind burned with unrelenting clarity. Assistants came and went, but none could keep pace with his dictation. When asked how he sustained it, he said, "Work is the breath that keeps me alive." His blindness had turned existence itself into meditation. Every calculation an act of faith, every theorem a prayer. In the winter of 1771, a blaze ripped through Euler's home in St. Petersburg. It started on the roof, a spark, a shout, then roaring heat. The smoke rolled through corridors filled with books, drawings, and decades of calculations. By the time the neighbors arrived with buckets, the library was gone, the heart of his life's work reduced to ash. For any other scholar, it would have been ruin. For Euler, it was memory's test. Standing in the wreckage, his face blackened with soot, he whispered to a student, "We will begin again." And he did. From the dark, he reconstructed his notes by dictation. Hundreds of pages, recalled line for line, proof for proof. It wasn't defiance, it was faith in order. The fire had erased paper, not thought. When others saw devastation, he saw an equation waiting to be rewritten. Catherine's court offered condolences, but Euler refused sympathy. "It burned what I had written," he said, "not what I have understood." Those words spread through Europe like gospel. Scholars marveled that blindness and fire could not stop him, that he had carried the universe entirely in his mind. For him, the disaster was almost symbolic, the destruction of the visible world, the persistence of the invisible one. By spring, the household was rebuilt and the rhythm of dictation returned. Yet something quiet had changed. The fire had stripped away attachment to possessions, to acclaim, even to time. What remained was essence. A man and his work, both now immune to loss. And in that new simplicity, his genius reached its purest form. Knowledge no longer bound by paper, only by will. Katerina's death came quietly in 1773. She had been ill for months, but in a home filled with calculation and light. No one imagined darkness could reach her. The morning she passed, the air smelled of ink and bread. Ordinary, peaceful. Euler, sitting beside her, felt her hand slip from his, and for the first time in years, he stopped speaking. Their marriage had been the one constant through decades of exile, illness, and fame. Her laughter had steadied him. Her presence had turned genius into gentleness. Now, the silence she left behind was unbearable. Letters from colleagues went unanswered. The quills gathered dust. Without her, he told a friend, "My equations do not add up." Months later, he married Salome Abigail, Katharina's half-sister, not from passion, but from duty. He needed help raising the children, someone to preserve the family Katharina had built. She cared for him tenderly, but the bond was practical, not poetic. The house was full again, yet emptier than before. Friends noticed the change. The once steady rhythm of his dictation now carried pauses, small absences where her voice should have been. When asked if grief had dulled his work, he shook his head. "No," he said softly, "it has deepened it." Every new page became both a memorial and a confession that even logic must bow before love. And so, surrounded by family, Euler pressed on, working not to escape loss, but to live beside it. His theorems grew gentler, his tone more reflective. For the first time, the man who defined the universe began to measure the weight of the heart. In his final decade, Euler's thoughts turned inward, not toward mathematics alone, but toward meaning. Faith, which once battled reason in his youth, now rested beside it like an old friend. The boy who once sketched triangles during sermons had become the old man who prayed through equations. The world, he told a visitor, is God's geometry, perfect, infinite, and kind. He often asked his assistants to read scripture aloud between dictations. When they reached verses about creation, he would smile faintly and say, "Yes, that part I can confirm." To him, every theorem was a form of worship, not proof of God's existence, but participation in his design. The blind mathematician no longer sought the divine. He conversed with it daily through order and pattern. Younger scholars found his serenity unnerving. How could a man who had lost everything, sight, wife, possessions, remain so composed? Euler would reply, "Loss subtracts only what was temporary." It wasn't philosophy, it was experience distilled into truth. His house remained alive with children and students, their laughter blending with the rustle of papers. He taught with patience, urging them to see beauty before utility. "Mathematics," he said, "is not the conquest of chaos, it is its translation." By 1783, his body had weakened, but his spirit glowed steady. His faith and reason, once rivals, now formed the same equation. He had solved the riddle that haunted him all his life, that understanding the universe and loving it were the same thing. September 18th, 1783. The morning began like any other. Euler breakfasted with his family, his grandson on his lap, discussing the orbit of a newly discovered comet. His voice carried no trace of fatigue. At noon, he dined with a colleague, joking about the calculations that would one day guide ships between the stars. His mind was clear. The numbers were still perfect. After lunch, he returned to his desk, dictating quietly, describing the comet's path as if narrating a story. He paused, adjusted his breath, and began a new line. "Let the radius..." The sentence broke midair. His hand fell. The quill rolled from his fingers. "Father?" his son asked. No answer. Euler exhaled softly, the smallest smile frozen on his lips. His final words, spoken moments earlier, still hung in the air. "Ich sterbe." I am dying. The household fell silent. The man who had calculated the stars had joined them. For a few seconds, it seemed even time hesitated, unwilling to move without his permission. Then, as gently as he had lived, Leonhard Euler was gone. The Academy recorded the moment with a single line. He ceased to calculate and to live. But those who knew him said it differently. That he had simply carried his last equation beyond the reach of numbers. News of Euler's death spread across Europe like the passing of a comet itself. Scholars from Paris to London, from Geneva to Vienna, wrote tributes filled with disbelief. How could a single life produce so much? His funeral drew mathematicians, philosophers, and clergy, a gathering of minds united by awe. Catherine the Great sent her own wreath, calling him Russia's eternal thinker. Yet, even as the candles dimmed at his grave, his work refused to rest. The Academy continued to publish his papers for nearly 50 years after his death. Manuscripts found in drawers, loose pages, equations without titles. It was as if his mind had left fragments scattered across eternity. Each new discovery in mechanics, astronomy, or physics seemed to echo his hand. Students who had once sat at his table carried his legacy forward, teaching from memory the words he'd spoken in the dark. The Age of Enlightenment had given Europe many stars, but Euler's light did not fade with the century. It became part of its structure. His formulas guided the Industrial Revolution. His constants shaped modern engineering. His philosophy infused science with soul. Historians would later say that Euler did not belong to a century. He belonged to civilization itself. His blindness proved that vision is not a matter of eyes, but of understanding. His death proved that genius, when joined with humility, never dies. And so, more than 2 centuries later, the numbers still speak his name, a soft, eternal whisper across time. He could not see, yet he made the world see forever. Centuries have passed, yet the world still speaks in his language. Every engineer, physicist, programmer, and astronomer unconsciously whispers Euler's tongue, the symbols that shape our modern age, E, I, pi, f of x. These are not mere letters, they are living codes of logic, born from the mind of a man who worked in darkness and saw more clearly than the world around him. His equations became the connective tissue of science, the grammar of truth. Even artificial intelligence, the frontier of the 21st century, owes its breath to him. Every exponential curve, every sine wave, every function tracing the limits of thought, they all bend to the same architecture he built by candlelight. His work didn't just predict the future, it quietly constructed it. To modern scientists, Euler's formulas are timeless, tools that never age, solutions that never fail. His life answered the question that haunted his century: can faith, reason, and humanity coexist? With an unshakable yes. And so, the blind mathematician who once sat beneath a flickering candle became light itself. Not a flame that burns, but one that endures.